Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Monday, July 10th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. President Biden defends sending cluster bombs to Ukraine. So the Pentagon on Friday made it official. They announced that the U.S. would be giving Ukraine cluster bombs as part of a new $800 million weapons package. And they're specifically going to receive what are known as the dual purpose improved conventional munitions. And they come in different forms, but they're going to be getting the 155 millimeter artillery shell version. And they're designed to spread, these small bomblets that are packed into this shell. So President Biden on Friday defended his decision to arm Ukraine with these cluster munitions, even though that they're banned by over 100 nations because they are exceptionally harmful to civilians. So it's interesting. Last year, the White House actually said, when asked about Russia's reported use of cluster bombs, this is February 28th, 2022, and former White House press secretary Jen Psaki told reporters that if Russia's using cluster bombs, that would potentially be a war crime. But now, over a year later, the Biden administration has changed its tune on using this widely banned munition. So, speaking to CNN's Fareed Zakaria on Friday, President Biden said that he needed to send the cluster bombs because Ukraine and the U.S. are running out of ammunition. He said, quote, "This is a war relating to munitions, and they're running out of that ammunition, and we're low on it. And so, what I finally did, I took the recommendation of the Defense Department to not permanently, but to allow for this transition period while we get more 155 weapons for the Ukrainians," end quote. And what he means there is 155 millimeter. That's, the U.S. has sent over 1 million 155 millimeter artillery shells to Ukraine. I believe at this point it's around 1.5 million or maybe even more. So while you have Biden here framing this provision of cluster bombs as temporary, Colin Kahl, the U.S. Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, he said that the U.S. will arm Ukraine with at least hundreds of thousands of these cluster bombs. And cluster munitions are so hazardous to civilians because many of the small bomblets or submunitions, they are small, they look like kind of like hand grenades. A lot of them don't explode on impact, which means people can find them years later. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. dropped millions of cluster bomblets. I should have said hundreds of millions because it was really that much. But they dropped that many on Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And each country is still dealing with them today. They're still cleaning this up. So Kahl insisted that the cluster munitions the U.S. will send to Ukraine were tested and said that they have a dud rate of less than 2.35%. So that dud rate is supposed to mean only, less than 2.35% of them will not explode. But the New York Times actually did some good reporting on this, and they found that the rate will likely be closer to 14%. And that's due to factors on the battlefield that are not taken into account during these tests. And they cited experts and unnamed officials. So based on that 14%, each 155 millimeter artillery shell is going to be packed with 72 of these bomblets at a 14% dud rate. That means they'll each leave about 10 unexploded bombs, and that's a huge hazard for civilians if they're not cleaned up. Not to mention, Ukrainian soldiers say they're firing these at the Russians, and then they advance. It's going to be a risk to them as well. So Kahl said that the U.S. has received assurances from Ukraine that they won't use cluster munitions in civilian populated urban environments. But cluster munitions are, notorious for killing people in rural areas. That's kind of the big problem, is that they're not, it's hard to find them in the woods and stuff. And it's usually farmers that come across them and, get killed or maimed by them, or children playing in forests or playing in fields. Those seem to be the most common victims when you hear about it happening in Vietnam or Laos. So Ukraine also, they have these assurances, but they've used cluster bombs against civilian populated areas. In 2014, going back then during the Donbass war, Human Rights Watch reported that the Kiev government was using cluster munitions in populated areas of Donetsk City. And Ukraine has also used them in populated areas during the current conflict with Ukraine. A day before the Pentagon announced that it was arming Ukraine with cluster bombs, Human Rights Watch had another report that said Ukrainian forces killed at least 8 civilians with cluster bombs in the eastern city of Izium in 2022. And Human Rights Watch also said that Russian forces have killed many civilians with cluster bombs. And that's kind of, so you have the Biden administration saying, oh, Russia's been using them this whole time. That's their logic. So if Russia's using a weapon that indiscriminately kills civilians, we should enable that as well. And they also point to the fact that there's been a lot of mines laid. There's a ton of minefields right now in Ukraine. So they're basically saying, they're going to have to clean it up anyway. So we might as well add to the problem. That's the logic. And the U.S., Russia, and Ukraine are not signatories to the treaty that bans cluster munitions, which is known as the Convention on Cluster Munitions, but many U.S. allies are. So we have a few stories here about the cluster bombs because I think it is a big deal that they're sending these things. And the next one here, Cambodia's prime minister urges Ukraine not to use U.S. cluster bombs. So I thought this was interesting. Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Sen has urged Ukraine not to employ U.S.-provided cluster bombs in its war against Russia, pointing to the U.S. legacy of cluster munition use in his country as a warning. So he wrote on Twitter, quote, it would be the greatest danger for Ukrainians many years or up to 100 years if cluster bombs are used in Russian occupied areas in the territory of Ukraine, end quote. So according to U.S. bombing data, the U.S. dropped 26 million cluster bomblets on Cambodia during the Vietnam War, and about 25% did not explode. So that is over 1 million of these unexploded munitions that are, in Cambodia. And, they've been cleaning them up and they still are. And since 1979, about 20,000 Cambodians have been killed by unexploded American bombs and landmines. And so the landmines, a lot of them, they were planted during Cambodia's civil war. So I'm not sure what the breakdown is, but it's just a lot of people killed by weapons, years after these wars are over. It's a real shame. Hun Sen pointed to Cambodia's painful experience of resulting from the U.S. dropping cluster bombs on the country, something that Cambodians are still feeling today. He said, quote, it has been more than half a century. There have been no means to destroy them all yet, end quote. And I was reading something else about how Cambodian farmers are always really nervous tilling if their land is soft, which usually means that it's very fertile soil. So it's usually good for a farmer, but the bomblets could get absorbed into soft soil and not explode, or they land softly and, they could get covered over time. So that's, one of the concerns, hard, rocky clay soil, they mostly explode. So the Cambodian leader called on the U.S. not to supply the cluster bombs and for Ukraine not to use them. He said, quote, as my pity for the Ukrainian people, I appeal to the U.S. president as the supplier and the Ukrainian president as the recipient not to use cluster bombs in the war because the real victims will be Ukrainians, end quote. All right. The next one here, Congressional Democrats and U.S. allies break with Biden on cluster bombs. President Biden's decision to arm Ukraine with cluster bombs has sparked rare Democratic criticism of his proxy war with Russia, and some of the U.S.'s top NATO allies have also spoken out against the move. So, this is the first time I'm seeing Democrats in Congress criticizing something Biden is doing related to Ukraine. So this is Representative Betty McCollum. She's a Democrat from Minnesota. She's the top Democrat on the House Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense. She said, quote, the decision by the Biden administration to transfer cluster munitions to Ukraine is unnecessary and a terrible mistake. The legacy of cluster bombs is misery, death, and expensive cleanup generations after their use. These weapons should be eliminated from our stockpiles, not dumped in Ukraine, end quote. So 19 House progressives issued a joint statement condemning the move. Representative Barbara Lee, she's a Democrat from California, progressive. She signed on to the statement and she went on CNN and said that cluster bombs should never be used and that Biden was crossing a line by providing them. NATO allies Spain, the UK, and Canada, which are all parties to the Convention on Cluster Munitions, they've warned against providing Ukraine with these bombs. Spain's defense minister said, quote, Spain, based on the firm commitment it has with Ukraine, also has a firm commitment that certain weapons and bombs cannot be delivered under any circumstances, end quote. Even the British are, warning against this, and they've been kind of the most reckless NATO members when it comes to promising to send tanks first and kind of leading the charge, pushing for the planes, sending the longer range missiles, sending depleted uranium first. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak said that the UK will uphold its commitment as a signatory to the Convention on Cluster Munitions, and the Canadian government said in a statement that it does not support the use of cluster munitions. So it's interesting. I don't think the opposition, in Congress is enough really to stop this. Although this next one here is an article from Responsible Statecraft. Representatives Jacobs and Omar plan to stop cluster bomb. They have a plan to try to block this, but we'll see. Hopefully it works. But this is Democratic Representative Sarah Jacobs. She's in California, and Ilhan Omar, Minnesota. They introduced an amendment to the 2023 NDAA that would effectively block the transfer of these munitions. So the amendment reads, quote, notwithstanding any other provision of law, no military assistance shall be furnished for cluster munitions. No defense export license for cluster munitions may be issued, and no cluster munitions or cluster munitions technology shall be sold or transferred, end quote. So they're trying to tack this to the NDAA, which means it would not become law until the NDAA is passed. If it is added to it, I don't know. I don't think there's really going to be enough opposition to get this on there. And again, it's going to take time. So that $800 million weapons package that the U.S. just announced that they're sending the cluster bombs in, that's what they call that presidential drawdown authority, which means Biden can ship them straight from U.S. military stockpiles. So they could already be on the way, and they're saying they're going to send hundreds of thousands. So if they know there's opposition coming, they might just dump as many as they can in there. So Omar, they put out, both of them put out some good quotes about this, just, warning against using cluster bombs, but we'll see. Maybe the opposition will grow. All right. The next one here, President Biden suggests the Israel model for Ukraine. So President Biden said Friday that Ukraine will not be brought into NATO anytime soon, but said that he was willing to give Kiev support similar to what the U.S. provides Israel. So this is again with an interview he did on Friday with CNN. He said, quote, I don't think there is unanimity in NATO about whether or not to bring Ukraine into the NATO family now, at this moment in the middle of the war, end quote. He acknowledged that bringing Ukraine into NATO would mean NATO's at war with Russia. NATO is holding a summit in Vilnius starting this Tuesday. So that's going to be held Tuesday, Wednesday. Those will probably be big news days for us. The alliance is expected to give new commitments to Ukraine. Kiev is seeking a promise that it can join NATO once the war is over, but the U.S. has expressed reluctance to give that pledge. Biden said that there are other outstanding issues besides the war that need to be considered before offering Ukraine membership, which is interesting. He's basically saying other reforms need to be made. So he's making it sound like, it's a very long way off, even if the war ends, which, there's no end in sight right now. But he's still saying, even if the war ends, there's still going to be a lot of things that need to be done, which is interesting. You're saying this country needs reforms. He says that they need to democratize more. So they need to do that to get into NATO, but they don't need to do any of that to get, tens of billions of dollars in military aid from the U.S., which is kind of strange. So Biden also mentioned how he refused to give Putin a guarantee that Ukraine won't ever join NATO before Russia invaded Ukraine. He said, quote, the very first time I met with Putin 2 years ago in Geneva, and he said, I want commitments on no Ukraine in NATO. I said, we're not going to do that because it's an open door policy, end quote. So there's the open door. And, we always have to remind ourselves of this, that this was, Russia's main demand when they were negotiating with the U.S. before the war, and the U.S. refused to engage them on it. A State Department official said so. I'm blanking on his name, but Biden is saying it right here too. It's not like it's a secret. But at the same time, he was saying Ukraine's not joining NATO anytime soon. I remember in December 2021, U.S. officials speaking to AP said that they told Ukraine, you're not joining NATO within the next decade. 10 years is a long time. Why couldn't they give something to Russia in writing or offer that, say, at least 10 years? I don't know. They just refuse to engage on the issue at all. So, to the Israel model thing, an alternative for Ukraine that is being considered by NATO members is an Israel model, and President Biden discussed it in this interview, and I believe this is the first time he mentioned it publicly. There's been a lot of reports saying that this is something that was under consideration, and other officials from other countries have mentioned this. But Biden suggested that this won't happen until there's a ceasefire. So I'll read his quote. It's a Biden quote, so bear with me. He said, quote, "And one of the things I indicated is the United States would be ready to provide while the process was going on, and that's going to take a while to provide security a la the security we provide for Israel, providing the weaponry they need, the capacity to defend themselves. If there is an agreement, if there is a ceasefire, if there is a peace agreement," end quote. So he's saying at the end, this will happen if there's an agreement, if there's a ceasefire, if there's a peace agreement. And again, long way off. So maybe we won't see them promise to sign a deal with Ukraine at the Vilnius summit. Because the situation with the U.S. and Israel, they sign these memorandums of understanding that outline the military aid. So the one that they're working on now, it provides Israel with $38 billion in military aid over a 10-year period, and that's from fiscal year 2019 to 2028. So it gives Israel $3.8 billion in military aid annually. But Israel does not receive mutual defense guarantees from the U.S. like NATO members do. All right, the next one here, this is from Kyle at the Libertarian Institute. Turkey backs NATO membership for Ukraine, but not for Sweden. So this is interesting. Erdogan, the Turkish president, has come out in favor of Ukraine joining NATO, but remains firmly opposed to Sweden joining the bloc. And the policy puts him at odds with Biden, who supports Sweden joining, but not Ukraine. So he met with Zelensky in Istanbul on Friday and said that Ukraine deserves NATO membership without a doubt. On the same day, Biden was saying, no NATO membership. So it's just kind of an interesting difference that they have here. And, he could just be telling Zelensky what he wants to hear while he was visiting, because I'm sure Zelensky isn't happy at, his relationship with Putin. But Putin is going to visit Turkey soon as well. That's something Erdogan said. So he's still engaging with the Russians, unlike most NATO leaders. All right, the next one here, former U.S. official defends meeting with Lavrov. So Richard Haas, a former U.S. diplomat and the former president of the Council on Foreign Relations, he just stepped down from that position. But he defended a meeting that he held with Russian Minister Sergei Lavrov that was first reported by NBC News last week. So I went over this in the previous show. There was this report from NBC that said Haas and two other former U.S. officials who were both also members of the Council on Foreign Relations met with Lavrov in April when he was in New York for a UN Security Council meeting. The report said that Lavrov and the former U.S. officials discussed potential diplomatic off-ramps and the fate of Russian-controlled Ukrainian territory. So the Russian Foreign Ministry on Friday confirmed that the meeting took place on April 24th, but disputed the idea that they were secret negotiations or that they discussed a potential Ukraine peace plan. So it's kind of confusing because on Thursday, the Russian Foreign Ministry called this fake news. This is Maria Zakharova. She is the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman. But then the next day, she kind of clarified, saying that they did meet, but it wasn't secret negotiations, kind of saying that was fake. The way it was reported wasn't right, is basically what she's saying. But she said that the talks were part of regular discussions that Lavrov and other Russian officials will hold, when leading delegations to the UN. It was during a meeting at the UN Security Council, and it was, on the sidelines of that they met. And basically she's saying, yeah, this is normal engagement. And she said it was actually the former U.S. officials who did not want the meeting to be made public, which I thought was interesting. She said, quote, "They are justifiably concerned about the highly toxic atmosphere in the American media and the reaction of the U.S. authorities," end quote. So Haas and other officials who attended the meeting did come under a lot of criticism from Russia hawks in the U.S. for engaging with Lavrov, and the Biden administration distanced itself from the talks. In an article on his Substack, Haas said that the unofficial that unofficial meetings are important as there is little engagement between the US and Russian governments. He wrote, quote, "Such meetings can be valuable opportunities to keep channels of communication open at moments when official interactions are either non-existent or unproductive and the stakes high. They permit participants to convey their views on a range of subjects while providing an opportunity to get better of the thinking of those associated with other countries and governments. Critically, such meetings are conversations, not negotiations. Those involved speak for themselves, not for any institution they might be affiliated with, and certainly not for the US government, although relevant government officials are kept informed about what is taking place." End quote. So he had the same characterization that Zakharova had, that they're not negotiations, they're just talks and not in an official capacity. But I think, he's right. I think talks are good. And unfortunately, Blinken isn't doing his job. So it's good that at least some people are talking to the Russians. All right. The next one here, the U.S. wants the ASEAN nations to push back against China. So a senior State Department official said Friday that the U.S. was looking at building relationships with Southeast Asian nations to push back against China in the South China Sea. So this is Daniel Crittenbrink. He's the U.S. Assistant Secretary for East Asian and Pacific Affairs. He made the comments when discussing Secretary of State Antony Blinken's upcoming trip to Indonesia, where he will meet with foreign ministers from the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that's the ASEAN, from July 15th to the 16th. So Crittenbrink said, quote, "In our view, it's not a matter of getting countries on board with the U.S. view. It's a matter of working with our ASEAN partners to advance our shared view and vision for the region and to push back on behavior that runs counter to that vision and to those principles, including the many irresponsible acts that we've seen carried out by China over the last several years and in the last several weeks," end quote. So the South China Sea has become a potential flashpoint for a conflict between Washington and Beijing. The U.S. has increased its military presence in the disputed waters and has pledged to intervene if Philippine vessels come under attack in the area. China, the Philippines, and several other Southeast Asian states have overlapping claims to the South China Sea. So while you have, the Philippines is signing all these new deals with the U.S. is expanding its military presence in the Philippines. The other ASEAN countries are not really eager to go along with the U.S. They want to play things down the middle, or some of them want to be closer to China, like Cambodia, for instance. And also, they haven't had a coordinated response to what China's been doing in the South China Sea because many of them have overlapping claims. You see the map here, if you're watching the video. Vietnam this is the blue line, very sweeping claims. They overlap with the Philippines and Malaysia and Brunei. So they all kind of have their own issues to deal with. So that's a big factor in all of this. And, this is one thing, Janet Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, is in China now. The U.S. keeps saying, oh, we want to improve relations. We want to, talk with China. We got to talk. But at the same time, they're doing things like this, openly saying that they're going to try to work with China's neighbors to push back against China. So, they say one thing, but they do another thing. All right. So the last story here, this is an article from Middle East Eye, and it's about how the state of New Hampshire has introduced an anti-BDS executive order. So the U.S. state of New Hampshire has introduced a new order that bars the state from investing in companies that boycott Israel, joining more than 30 other states that have put in place some form of anti-boycott, divestment, and sanctions legislation. So if you're not familiar with BDS, it's, a movement that calls for the boycott of Israeli products, specifically a lot of the time things that are made in the West Bank, but it's to put pressure on Israel over the treatment of Palestinians and, to divest, and ultimately they want sanctions, but they're a long way from getting that. But over 30 U.S. states have anti-BDS laws on the books. And this specific executive order that was signed by New Hampshire's Republican governor prohibits the state from investing in companies that boycotted Israel. So We saw this really play out with Ben and Jerry's and Unilever. So Ben and Jerry's is the ice cream company. They're owned by Unilever, which is a British conglomerate. And Ben and Jerry's announced that it would stop selling ice cream in the West Bank and in occupied East Jerusalem. And Israel freaked out and launched this lobbying campaign. And all these American states, I know Florida, Texas, I believe New York, New Jersey, and a few others started taking action against Unilever and selling off their shares that were in pension funds and things like that. And the way it ended was that Unilever sold its Israeli operation, Ben and Jerry's Israel operation, to a company in Israel. But it's just amazing that these states have these laws that clearly go against the First Amendment. Punishing companies for boycott, their right to boycott things. And this also applies to contractors. The laws are different slightly in each state, but I know in some states, if you're a contractor, and this has happened to teachers and just regular workers, and you sign a contract to work with the state over a certain amount of money, again, depending on the state, it says that you pledge not to boycott Israel, that you're not boycotting Israel and you're not planning to in the future. So it's essentially a loyalty oath. So you could imagine, any other country. So there's laws like this targeting people that were trying to boycott China. I mean, it would be an outrage. At this signing ceremony, Israel's ambassador to the UN attended it when the New Hampshire's governor signed this thing. So, but because this is an executive order, this doesn't really have the force of law. And New York did this too. I believe it was when Cuomo was in, he signed an executive order like this. But it all depends if the state legislatures would go along with it. But in the other states, which is over 30 states, these laws have passed through the legislatures and were signed by the governor. And this is all Israel, lobbying for this and bragging about it. Netanyahu has bragged about how they influence these American states to sign these laws. So just something I don't think that gets enough attention. That's it for the news for today. Go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Ted Snyder, what a negotiated settlement to the Ukraine war could look like. One from Ted Galen Carpenter, can Washington be saved from itself at the NATO summit? One from Daniel DePetris, bombing Mexico to stop cartels from supplying U.S. with fentanyl is a terrible idea. That's at the Chicago Tribune. One from Joseph Solis Mullen at the Libertarian Institute, the fake China threat then and now. And one from Caitlin Johnstone at her website, Return of a Disgraced Neocon. That's about Elliot Abrams getting that nice appointment from President Biden. But that's everything for me for today. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe on YouTube. Leave comments. Please give me feedback. All stuff like that really helps out. Follow us on Twitter. Join our email lists. But that's it. I will be back tomorrow. Thanks for listening.